spelt it wrong. Hello. Hopefully you've already seen the little intro video that I did, just explaining what we're going to be doing here. But obviously now we're talking about the next Schwarzenegger film that I'll be looking at, which is Terminator Genisys. Oh yes, it's 5-year anniversary of the film this year. And that is what I do generally, is watch Schwarzenegger films on their anniversaries, so year, 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, etc. And that way I find the films stay fresh and I don't end up getting, I wouldn't say bored with any of them, but it's just nice to come to a film having not seen it for a little while. The exception is the Terminator films, which I watch on a loop in release order, which creates some issues further down the line, but there we are. So coming up is Terminator Genisys, which is the first Terminator film that I watched this year, and it follows on from Terminator Salvation that I watched last year, and of course Terminator Dark Fate that I watched at the cinema. So it's kind of a little bit of odd placement for Genisys, having watched Dark Fate, but it is the film that sits really completely on its own. It has almost no connection to any of the other films. So you have the first 4 finishing with Salvation, and that is that continuity, and then we have Genisys. The thing that still breaks my heart about Genisys is that it was clearly set up for at least one film, if not 2 more. There's some mysteries in the plot that weren't fully revealed at release, and we even had a post-credits sequence. So the idea is we're going to get another film, and we're going to play around with some more ideas. I think they were looking at ideas about John and how he was coping with the change that that he was going through and the type of person that he was. Some really interesting ideas coming out of it, and it still breaks my heart that we didn't get to continue that at all. So it kind of sits there on its own because it's not connected to the previous ones, nor was it connected to the one after. So it itself ignored the previous films, even T2, even the Terminator mostly, and it did the kind of Star Trek, the 2009 Kelvin universe, the Star Trek idea of using time travel as a way to tell a different story. And then we had Dark Fate after it, which ignored it also. So it is just sitting there on its own. And someone asked me the other day whether I would prefer a Genisys sequel or a Dark Fate sequel. And it's really difficult because I really, really wanted a Dark Fate sequel. But the benefit with Dark Fate is that it was very self-contained. So it was written pretty much like the first film to be this little self-contained film. You wouldn't need anything else. But it'd be great if there were sequels, whereas Genisys was written with the intention of having follow-ups that did not appear. So I would love to see a Genisys sequel, but obviously that's not going to happen because that continuity now has been erased. Genisys is a tricky one, I think, maybe for a casual viewer, because they're like, where does it fit in? It doesn't really. It's an alternate timeline. There's some lovely stuff that parallels the original war, but it's different. And the one big thing to show that it's different is that Reese still has his photo of Sarah at the time of the TDE mission, whereas we know from the original film in that timeline it was destroyed beforehand. So it's a completely different war. There are a couple of other things, you know it's a different war, but presumably it comes from one of the early cycles. So personally my view on it is not that it's one sort of self-enclosed loop, but I think that initially Sarah had, John had a different dad, and that Reese was sent back with Sumner originally, and that Skynet was created from molecular memory, so Cyberdyne created it by itself. So all these little bits and pieces. And I think the Genisys timeline comes from one of those initial loops before the timeline that we see in the first film. So it's linked, but it's not quite the same. So it makes it really unique. It just kind of floats there now. So yeah, I am a massive fan. I'll go into a little bit my initial view on it, but I'm a massive fan of Genisys. It's a wonderful film. The music is amazing. Performances are incredible, particularly Jason Clarke. He really knocks it out of the park for me in this film. It's amazing, and he gets a lot of flack, which bugs me. And people at the time moaned about the film and ignored the fact that it was Arnold's second highest or second most successful film worldwide ever. And it was the opposite with Dark Fate. They ignored the story and talked about the box office, so you can't win. But Genisys is, massively up there. I'm really, really excited to watch it again. I've still got a Blu-ray that I have not yet unwrapped, so that will be the one. Okay, so I'm going to look at just a couple of random topics, and we'll see how we go. Okay, so as I've said, Jason Clarke is, I'm always wary to say my favourite John Connor, but he's up there. He was the 8th and to date final actor to play him. Dark Fate spoilers, if that's still a thing. Obviously he does appear in Dark Fate and is based on Edward Furlong. There were other people involved. Obviously Edward Furlong's appearance. There was the young actor who sort of was him on set. We saw photos of him with Brett Azar. And he also had the voice, because you can hear him having a little chat with a girl at a bar before the inevitable happens. So it's not a new interpretation. And therefore with Dark Fate, that makes Edward Furlong, who was already the most prominent John Connor, having played him in 2 productions, T2 and T2 3D, it makes him the only John to appear in more than one film. But Jason Clarke is the last to date, and I remember being really, really happy with this news, because I knew him from Public Enemies in 2009 with Christian Bale, ironically enough, and Johnny Depp, which is weird. Public Enemies is a weird one anyway. It came out the same year as Terminator Salvation, and at the time when they promoted it, which makes sense, they said Johnny Depp, Christian Bale, Public Enemies. It makes sense because there's 2 of them. And then when Salvation was kind of struggling a little bit, to the point where they were putting the Arnold, the CGI, the T-Rip in the trailers when it was originally meant to be a surprise, they put him in. And the Public Enemy trailers at the same time changed to be Johnny Depp, Public Enemies, which doesn't quite make sense. Just really weird. But of course in that film was Jason Clarke, and I remember really liking Jason Clarke in that film. And then they cast him as John Connor. That was amazing. And I thought, this is awesome. You know, it's not hugely known. They were considering Tom Hardy at one point, and I partly would be quite intrigued to see that. But we have Jason Clarke instead. And my only regret is that we don't get to see more of him. We don't get to see him as John, just being John. because obviously he's the T3000 and he kills it, I have to say. But there is that part of you that's like, it's a shame, I would like to see him as John, but he's fantastic as John in the opening, the way that he talks about he was going to have a beer and he hadn't really thought about post-war, and he's fantastic as the T3000. Just that kind of charm that he has is fantastic. I love the performance, I absolutely love it. It's just that tiny regret that he wasn't more John, but I think he's brilliant. First and to date only Australian to play the role. Weird also because Jai Courtney, who's Kyle Reese, Jai or Jay, him who's Kyle Reese, also is Australian, and also has the initials JC. There was an Australian in Salvation as well, in Marcus Wright, Sam Worthington. So it's just interesting that we've got this link. You've also got the JC connection, so you've got Jason Clarke, Jai Courtney, John Connor, James Cameron, and Jesus Christ. Really the only link there is that John Connor and Christ have the same initials, which may tie into that kind of Messiah idea. But I always thought that was pretty interesting. Also, that Jason Clarke shares his surname with Amelia Clarke. No relation, but they're the only John and Sarah Connors to share the same surname. So that's pretty cool. But I absolutely love him. The other thing that's kind of interesting with Jason Clarke's John is he's not really linked to any other John. So when you're looking at all 8 Johns, they're all kind of playing the same person, so you can kind of guess that John would look like Edward Furlong when he's 10, and he might look like Thomas Dekker when he's 16, but they're not all linked, and it gets kind of complicated because you've got Edward Furlong, who's kind of the anchor, the T2 John. In SEC continuity, he would go on to be Thomas Dekker's version. In T3 continuity, he'd go on to be Nick Stahl's version, but those two are not connected. They might look like each other, maybe, possibly, but they're not connected. They have no connection. Completely different continuities. Jason Clarke isn't linked to any of them because he's from this timeline that unfortunately we don't know anything else about really, apart from this one film. So it just kind of sits there. The closest we get really is the connection to Michael Edwards, T2 John Connor, who became the standard John in almost everything. He was the John in the Dark Years comic book. He was the John in Cybernetic Dawn, Nuclear Twilight comics. He was the John in Dawn of Fate. He's kind of the basis of John in some of those early video games. He's just the John. And really that's the connection that Jason Clarke has, in that they're both playing John on the same date, July 11th, 2029. That kind of opening sequence at the TDC is really heavily riffing off of the T2 Future War sequence with Michael Edwards. So there's lots of stuff where they're kind of linked. But it also does mean that Jason Clarke is the oldest Connor because he's Michael Edwards plus a few days. Unless there's muddy waters because you end up with Nick Stahl and how old he was when we see him in the Future War sequence of T3, and whether that's early war or late war, it gets difficult. So maybe Nick Stahl. If not, it's Jason Clarke. But he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And as I said, in terms of actual playing, he sits between Christian Bale in Salvation and Edward Furlong again in Dark Fate. But yeah, Jason Clarke is way up there as one of my all-time favourite Johns. I bow to you, sir. Okay, it's a little interesting thing with Genisys. It was the last of the films to have that particular naming convention, which is a one-word subtitle that is a religious word that has both a real-world meaning and an in-film meaning. And it all started with Terminator Redemption, the 2004 video game tie-in for T3. So again, one word, religious-themed. It had an in-world meaning, i.e. the 850 was trying to redeem himself. I've never actually finished the game because I'm a bad person, but from what I remember, John and Kate had died, and the 850, creating this sort of parallel world, and the 850 was trying to redeem himself. So that's the in-world explanation. And then in the real world, it was trying to redeem the kind of poor reception that the original T3 game got, and the PC game, War of the Machines, both were not received well. So this came along, it was like, we're trying to redeem ourselves. Here, redemption. And that stuck actually for the next 2 films. So Terminator Salvation done the same. One word, religious title. The in-world meaning was that Marcus Wright was trying to get salvation for the kind of life that he'd led by, at the end, finally sacrificing himself, giving up his heart for John. It's not entirely sure what he'd done. Different scripts and different drafts have different versions. One is that he killed some cops. One is, I think, he killed his brother. But basically, I mean, we know he'd done bad because he's on death row and, well, having the death penalty carried out in that opening scene. So yeah, he's a bad person. And so that is him trying to, save himself or be saved. And of course, the real world meaning, kind of similar to Redemption, is to save the series. We all know the fan base split really when T3 came out, and Salvation was trying to say, look, let's get it back on track with a post-war apocalyptic Terminator film. Just ramp out everything we can. Christian Bale's here, and it's trying to save the series, hence the Salvation. And Genisys did the same. It's the last one to do it to date. One with religious title, in-world. Actually, it's the only time it refers to something concrete. Genisys meaning the computer program, the operating software that becomes Skynet. Kind of reminded me of the Turk in SCC. Kind of a little thing that no one really thinks is going to be that massive, and then boom, becomes Skynet. So it's a real world thing that happens a lot. Hence the awkward spelling, which is now how I spell Genisys. Every time I'm writing it, I write that first and then go, I don't write the word Genisys a lot, but when I do, yeah, that throws me. And then of course the real world thing is it's doing that soft reboot, like the first book of the Bible. So it's doing that Star Trek thing. So it's just an interesting little pattern that was there from 2004 to 2015, which is kind of interesting. And then we take that basic idea of that soft reboot onto Genisys, and it is the first reboot in the series. So many people look at Salvation as a reboot. It's not. It's a direct sequel. There are T1s, but Genisys does it, and then of course Dark Fate does it as well, sort of. So it does get confusing, and you have to break free of the fact that the first 4 films were in this really nice, pretty single timeline, and then we start looking around a bit. Yeah, naming convention is a great little thing that I love. A little bit of trivia. Initial thoughts. In terms of the films that I saw at the cinema, it's T3 onwards. The first 2 were released, one before I was born and one when I was too young. But T3 I was there from the off. And to me, T3 and Genisys kind of sit in the same ballpark. T3, I had avoided the internet for a whole month because it was out in America July 2nd, and it was out over here August 1st. So I just pulled myself from the internet. I hadn't read any reviews. And then on the day I was going to see it, I decided that I would read a review in the back of a gaming magazine, and I'd be like, yeah, it's fine. And I read it, and it was a bad review. And that tainted my whole thing. Plus, it was my first Terminator film at the cinema, and at that point, the fan base was united. It was like the early church. We were all one, and everyone was like, "Oh, Terminator films are awesome." So there's a lot of expectation on this film, which is kind of lessened as we've gone on. And I went seeing someone else as well, and they were asking questions, and it was kind of difficult. And it took me a while to kind of get used to the ideas that they were playing with and the characters and how it compared to the other films, and that did take a while. And I got there eventually, and I was like, actually, there's some amazing stuff in here. Salvation was the opposite. Salvation just had me hooked from the start, to the point that when I came out of the cinema, my neck hurt because I'd been like that through the whole thing. So I came out and I was like, oh, That was amazing. So when I read, again, questionable reviews, I was like, what are you talking about? This is insane. And then when it came to Genisys, it was kind of like T3 because it was so different. I went on my own, which is my usual way of doing Terminator films now. And I really enjoyed it, but I had to there were things that we were struggling with. There was no connection with the other films. Arnold was back though, which was Biggie, Jason Clarke. It was kind of the having someone else as Sarah and not be Linda Hamilton at that age as well. We'd had it with Linda Headey and SEC, but this was a bit different, and I did struggle, admittedly, just to get used to the character and where they were taking it. And also the fact, of course, Genisys spoilers, that's the thing, that Arnold lived at the end. And that threw me. I thought, oh, he's dead, that's nice, that's an emotional ending. And then he came back through the blast door. And I was like, what? That took me a while. That took me a while to get used to that idea. But of course, now I look at it, I'm thinking, they're playing with those expectations. People always ask, what would have happened if Reese had lived at the end of the first film? Ta-da! What would have happened, they said, after T2 if Uncle Bob had lived? Ta-da! But of course, it's not explored anymore, but that's not the film's fault. Just to see what they would have done with that makes me... Anyway. But it did take a while to get used to some new ideas that they were representing. And then Dark Fate was like salvation. I loved it from the start. I thought, this is incredible. Just from hearing Sarah's voice over the opening credits, I was like, wow. That's something special. I mean, they all are. They've all got stuff, but I've had... It's either been, okay, I can do this in a kind of slow burn reaction, or I'm in love with it from the off. And, in all cases, for everything now, I love everything. Everything about Terminator, I am there. I am 100% fanboy. I'm sure there was something else. Oh, yeah, there was one other thing. One thing that I like, the design of the T3000 is awesome. There's actually some things in Genisys that seemingly come from the original idea for T3. One, that John is actually responsible for the bringing around Skynet. In the T3 early draft, he was a programmer who accidentally brought it around, which is still just a weird idea. Why would you be anywhere near computers? But obviously in Genisys, he is responsible because he's the T3000, but there's still that idea, that visual imagery of him being responsible and bringing Skynet online, working for Cyberdyne. There's lots of parallels. The other biggie is there's some things that the T3000 can do that the original TX, the TIG, which is way even before Vin Diesel was considered, some of the things that TIG could do, notably turn itself into matter, which is presumably just a kind of next step of the liquid metal idea that the T3000 had, the pools of chrome have matter flying about. Obviously they didn't do it with the TX, but you do get that idea with the T3000. If you look at that end fight sequence with Pops, and he just sort of almost goes through him, and then he's on the other side. So there's lots of things they kind of took from that early draft of T3. But also, if you look at all of these things, if you look at Genisys, and you look at Dark Fate and T3, they're all different timelines. And to me, the TX always kind of logistically made sense as a follow-up to the T1000. The T1000, according to the novel, Skynet didn't want to use because there was no central processor, so it could decide to go against Skynet if it wanted. And actually we see that kind of idea with the anti-Skynet machines in SEC, which is a point of interest. But yes, so we see the T1000. Skynet is a little bit worried that it hasn't got that CPU, and also it's weak against extreme temperatures. So it makes sense that it creates something with an endoskeleton. So in my mind, it goes back to the 900 endo, which is a sore point I'm aware of for some people, and uses that endo with some enhancements, but combines that with the metal polyalloy. So we get the CPU and we get a stronger defense against extreme temperatures, and you end up with a TX. Boom. Now for me, the placement of a post T1000 also works for the T3000 and the Rev 9 in a way. The T3000 is the same end war, injecting nanomachines into people, and you can almost again, there's so many things I would have loved to have explored. You know, we don't quite know about if there was a T-1000 in this timeline or what. We know it's toward the end of the war. It may be that they created the T-1000 and it had the same issues, so they wanted to, instead of creating a Terminator, they were trying to experiment by using nanomachines in people. It depends how that war was playing out. Or it may have been instead of the T-1000. You know, develop nanomachines, but put them into people rather than a Terminator, and you end up with the T-3000. Forgive me. So I'm just editing this video. It's obviously taken longer than I was expecting, hence this thing that's appeared. But I must just say, obviously in the video just now, I'm talking about how in the Genisys timeline that we see, the war we see, we don't know the development of the Terminators. It's weird, I'm looking at myself out of the camera. Yeah, so we don't know the development. And I was talking about how we don't know if the T-3000, when they're injecting people with nanomachines, we don't know whether they are post T-1000s or instead of T-1000s. And I said that as a legitimate point. It's important to note that I watched this before I watched the film. Not for the first time, obviously, but in the current cycle. And I think that it'd probably been 2 years since I've last seen it, and I just wasn't thinking. Because obviously, there's a T-1000 in the film. Yeah. And of course the point is, it was stated, you know, that was the writer's intention that Pops was Uncle Bob. It's not a theory that I like, but what they were getting at was that when the original Terminator was sent back, in the that first timeline, or the original timeline, John turns to the next Terminator and they reprogram him, and that becomes Uncle Bob. And the idea here is that the first Terminator has gone back and they send back the very next one as Pops. That does not make him Uncle Bob. Just as a side note, it's a completely different timeline and a completely different set of screws. But okay. But the point is that Terminator was sent from that timeline, which means so was the T-1000. So it's quite clear that yes, T-1000s existed, and the nanomachines are post that. And in fact, thinking about it, the very fact that it's a T-3000 suggests that there was a T-1000. I suppose you could argue we don't know what it was, but it was definitely a magnetic polyalloy. We see it. I was talking crap. I apologise. Back to smaller beard me. So there are certainly similarities development-wise. Same with the Rev 9. The Rev 9 and the TX, to me, really have similarities. Liquid metal and an endoskeleton. So you can almost imagine a T-1000 and then go, okay, we've got to improve it. How do we do it? Rather than going the TX route, they decided to have an endo and a separate, almost T-1000. And that's kind of like the TX if you'd split the TX into component parts. But they were able to operate independently. So I love how all of those three units, those three series, possibly come around through the development of the T-3000, the T-1000, or nanomachines at least, and each Skynet takes a slightly different path, which I think is pretty awesome. Okie dokie. Finally wrapping up. I'm just going to have a little look at a couple of bits. So obviously, Salvation was the last Terminator film that was really massively supported elsewhere. It had loads of toys, loads of figures, loads of books. I'll get into that. Loads of reference books as well, comics. Genisys did not, and Genisys didn't have any novels. Genisys didn't have any comics apart from the free black and white one that you got at Walmart, which I would still love to have. And then, so I was thinking that I was just going to have maybe a couple of magazines that I got and some DVDs. And then I remembered that, of course, they did a book, not a novel, but they did a reference book. So I went into the attic to find it, which is this, and it's a book that is incredible. Resetting the Future. it's exactly that image, the Terminator melting, which was the first poster I saw of Genisys out and about. I saw it on a wall, had my picture taken by it, of course. But this is a stunning book that I just haven't looked in enough. It's brilliant. It's by David S. Cohen. It's got a foreword by Arnold himself. TDE, wonderful stuff. It's an amazing book, absolutely amazing. And it can happily sit alongside Salvation's 2 reference books. And also there was a beautiful set for Terminator and T2. Not to mention the illustrated screenplay for T2, the making of book for T2. There's some beautiful books out there, and this sits alongside them. I've read the Salvation ones quite a lot. This one I haven't really looked at, but I absolutely will. This is an incredible book, absolutely amazing. And then while I was looking for the book, I also happened to stumble upon these 2 figures and went, oh yeah. Now I don't have any busts. I don't have any kind of extra large figures of any. I just have never had the money or space to display them, and I'm hoping that will change at some point. But I do have these. So these are really nice. There were originally 3 of them. Well, there were originally 2, which I have. So this is the young Guardian, and he comes with the Remington shotgun. I really like this packaging. You've got the Terminators with the plasma cannons heavily seen in the opening sequence. You've got the Aerial HK. There's some lovely stuff. You've got a little rundown, little biog of the T800, and also available is the other figure we've got here, and notably the older Pops figure with battle damage. Now it says coming soon. As far as I'm aware, it was released. As far as I can make out, it did see a release, but I do not have it, and I would love to have it. So there's this one. Now these are both by NECA, by the way, from 2015, so they're both released in conjunction with the film. And then we had T1000 in Police Disguise, which is awesome. Again, the same box. There's some lovely stuff with this actually, including interchangeable torso, so you've got the standard torso and then the battle damaged torso with the flower effects, the petal effects, interchangeable arms, pistol, and you've got a little biography on the back. So these are awesome. There's always that question whether to open them or not, but they look quite nice as they do at the moment on the side. So I remembered, but only just. I just went, oh, these! I completely forgot, and they look awesome. Unlike my Sarah Connor Funko Pop from Dark Fate, which the box is not ideal, but I have 2 of these, so that's alright. But yeah, there's some really nice stuff. I would like that old Pops figure. Would be pretty awesome. And there were some sort of larger figures which I would love to get. But of course, when we moved forward with Dark Fate, there was none of this. We had the Funko Pops. There were some larger figures. And actually, thinking about it, there was some small kind of quirky little, almost cartoon-like figures that I'd like to get. But there were no books. There were no comics. I think the soundtrack's available though, and I'd love to get that. Anyway, there we are. So Genisys, awesome. I'll be watching it soon. Cannot wait. You should watch it too. Yeah, boom. My next video, I'm not sure. It will be either on my next Arnold film, or it will be film reviews, which is the other thing that I'll be doing. So just as a quickie, it's the last film or the last couple of films that I've watched, just some extra information about the directors and actors and all that sort of thing, and the film itself. It should be fun. Boom. But I can't guarantee I'll have as much merchandise for those. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.